Hey everybody, welcome to Alan Wall's Photography. This is Alan, and I just wanted to let you know that I have found the devil, and he was in the details. That's what today's video is about. It's about details. We're going to tackle a fairly straightforward problem that is going to uncover why I've been banging on about paying attention to details for the last year. This is where it really counts. Let's say, for example, you have a photograph of a particularly attractive beetle that you want to put on your wall as an anniversary gift for your wife. Not a good idea, but let's say she actually likes insects and you decide you want to blow this 5mm insect up to a 12-foot wide print for your wall. Well, I'm going to show you how to do that today. I'm going to show you how to make an extremely high resolution photograph, almost as gigantic as you want to, using mostly only techniques that we've used before. It's called stacking and stitching. There are 4 phases. They are shooting the subject, number 1. Number 2, stacking the images. Number 3, stitching the stacked images together into something like a 2-dimensional panorama. And 4, I haven't really thought of a good S word for 4. Sanitizing the photograph, we'll say. That last little bit of retouching that can take all night long. So what we are going to be doing is photographing a small insect using a microscope objective. We're going to photograph it in parts, and we'll use a 10x. You can use higher or lower. You'll see that the amount of work explodes beyond exponentially once you start doing this, because you need so many photographs. I calculated that this particular project would take at least 6,000 images if we did the whole bug. I'm probably not going to do the whole bug. Simply, I don't have a day and a half to do this. But the bigger your insect and the more detail you're looking for, the higher the magnification, the more images you're going to need. And any mistake that gets made early in the process, during the shooting phase, or even before the shooting phase, mistakes you make there will get compounded as you stack the photographs, then stitch them together, till when you arrive at the final cleanup stage in Photoshop, there's really nothing you can do. I was doing one of these, I was going to do for this video a wasp, and that's the kind of photograph you want to set aside a week to do. So let's talk first about preparing your subject. I'm going to assume you're going to shoot an insect, but it really goes for whatever your subject is. First thing, it needs to be clean. And by clean, I mean soap and water, a couple of rinses, a trip to the ultrasonic, whatever it takes. If you are lucky enough to have a stereo microscope, examine it for dirt. And if it still has dirt on it, wash it again. Dry it like your life depended on it. Any amount of water or alcohol that's left in the hairs or the wings of an insect when you start shooting will result in changes over time. And remember, your bug is going to be set up on a pin under light for hours and hours. So if there are parts that are still damp, as they dry and the wings will open a bit more and the legs may straighten out or they may scrunch up. So get the bug dry. Normally for a photograph like this, I will wash it, dry it, pin it, and then leave it for a couple of hours. I'll photograph it when I start that wait period, and then I'll photograph it again and I'll compare the two. And if there's been any significant movement, I'll wait another hour or two. Only when I can get a couple of hours where nothing has moved, the antennas aren't slowly drooping down, everything is the same, then you're ready to start shooting. Like I said, avoid as much as you can hairy animals and animals whose limbs or wings or mouth parts are all crossing in a big jumble. You can do it, and I have done it myself. It adds a level of complexity that we don't want to get into today. When you have these crossing limbs, like you'll have a set of limbs in the background on the right side, then you'll have a set of limbs in the foreground, depending on how you set up your insect, of course. And sometimes the only way that you can sharply and beautifully separate those limbs where they cross is by using advanced stacking techniques, either selective stacking or slabbing. And trust me, you don't want to have to slab every one of these photographs. If you can get beautiful focus stacked image stacks, that's easier and that's better. So try to avoid crossing limbs if at all possible. What else about the bug? Pinning is a different beast as well. Now, I like to seldom actually puncture an insect with a pin, and oftentimes we'll use a little bit of glue to stabilize the bug. For this kind of photography, I use a very short, stout pin. I use a 0 insect pin instead of the 3 O's I normally use. And I glue not just a molecule or two of glue, I actually glue the pin to the other side of the insect. In this case, I want to photograph this tree hopper thing from the belly facing me, because he's got a lot of beautiful color, interesting structures, nice big eyeballs, but it's all on his belly side. So I have glued a pin. Well, I'll show it to you. This is the pin completely securely glued between his outer wing cases on the back. That again is something that it's worth investing a little time in, so that you don't end up with again a bug that moves during this process. You can't afford to have that. As much as you possibly can, avoid blown highlights or black shadows. By that I mean set up your lighting and position your insects so that you are really paying attention to getting the light into every nook and cranny. The reason is a lot of the times when we stack images like this, we end up getting noise that gets noisier as we stack, and we don't want anything but pristine detail on this bug. So using little reflectors, using additional lights, experiment with it, but take lots of test pictures. Take a bunch of pictures to make sure you're getting the light everywhere that you need it. I strongly recommend you shoot against a clean white background. I obviously suggest you shoot with flash. This is very, very hard to do with continuous lighting because of your high ISOs and slow shutter speeds. You are going to get vibration artifact, and it will multiply through the process of stacking them together. So go for flash. And if you have the luxury of being able to use 4 flashes, each at 1/128th or 1/256th power, do that rather than 1 flash at 1/8th power. The reason is faster exposures. The flash won't be illuminated but for a 20,000th of a second or thereabouts, and it's going to minimize vibration artifact, that type of thing. So I strongly recommend using flash and using a white background that has a flash, a dedicated flash all of its own, that creates a uniform, pure white background. If you can, if you're using a macro cage, it's no problem. I'm going to show you how mine is set up for this in just a second. But there is one other thing you need to do to prepare the actual collection of the photographs. And I'm going to take a few minutes to describe that, because to me, it's at the heart of doing this right. The first practical step in this process, in the shooting process, is to map out our intended shoot order. This is a time-consuming and tricky step to do, and there is always an inclination to skip it. I cannot tell you how many times I have let myself down by cutting that corner. Now I map every composite image, every super high resolution image I do. The first step is I take a photograph of the subject at whatever magnification I need for it to mostly fill the frame. So oftentimes I'll just, I keep a 50 millimeter enlarger lens right by my system at all times, because I'll just pop that on the bellows, adjust the bellows length to where I have exactly the magnification I need to get a full-size image of the bug. And I'll take a photograph and I'll print it. I print it onto just regular paper, something like this. I didn't show you that very well because I'm going to show all this in close-up. But yeah, once you have a picture at whatever magnification it takes to fill a page, go ahead and break that down and put your microscope objective on and get everything the way you want it to be for the next step. So when you have that photograph taken, go ahead and print it at full size onto just a sheet of regular paper. Don't waste printer paper for this. And keep this handy. I usually make several copies of it in case I make any mistakes, but this is going to be my map. Now what I do is, once I've switched out my system to the microscope objective and I've got my lights positioned and we're all good to go, I will take a photograph of a part of the insect. I'll either usually do the head or a limb, something that has enough features or landmarks that I can accurately position it within the frame. Then I take one photograph and I look at it. And let's say this is what the photograph looks like. I decide to photograph that limb, and I triple check this to make sure that this is exactly where the limb is positioned on the screen of my camera. I also check to make sure that if I'm using an APS-C camera like I am here, that my dimensions are correct, 3:2, because if I've drawn it wrongly, there's a problem. It should come out at about 3:2. Measure the height and the width, and take a piece of cardboard and cut the cardboard out about 1 centimeter wide of those dimensions. We want that to represent the screen on our camera, and that's exactly how it looks on the screen. So we're good to go. Make a boundary, what do you call this? A bit on the outside. About 1 centimeter deep is usually plenty. Now, what we're going to do is use this to plan our shots. But to make life even easier, what I also do is I like to use 25% overlap. So 25% is 7.5 millimeters when it comes to the width of the picture. So this mark is at 7.5 millimeters, and this, well, they don't look the same, but don't worry about it. It's close. 7.5 millimeters here. Because this is only 2 millimeters. It actually came out at 2 millimeters. So this is 0.5 millimeters each end. This is our overlap. And then what I do is I start at the top left hand, because we read left to right and top to bottom. I just like to stick with that. Position our frame for our first photograph and mark it and number it. That is photograph number 1. Now, this is the important part. For photograph number 2, we have to have overlap with photograph number 1. So we don't have to worry about height because we're just going horizontally right now. So what I do is I position my arrows over the edge of the box I just drew to draw the next box. Box number 2. And I go all the way across. I won't do it now, but when I get all the way to the end, then I drop down, leaving the same 25% overlap, and then I work my way back across the image until I run out of stuff. There's one place on this map where I ended up with nothing in the frame. I recommend you go ahead and make that a frame and shoot a picture there. You won't need but one picture, just an out of focus of the background. It just seems to help when we stitch all these together if you can have background all the way around. It probably doesn't make any difference, but just the way I do it. Now, you may look at this bug knowing it's only, 6-7 millimeters long, something like that, and say, well, that shouldn't take too many pictures to, even with a big overlap, just a handful of images and we could stitch them together for a high-res picture. Not so. This is the finished map for this shot. 45 frames. 45 frames, every frame with 25% overlap in all dimensions. And where is the frame that has nothing in it? Well, I guess I guess it does have something in it. Anyhow, if you do this, you won't leave anything out. If you don't do this, you'll do what I did yesterday, which was making this video using a wasp, and I left out part of its head. I talked about mapping it, but I didn't actually map it. And that's a really critical lesson for me. So this seems like a pain. It seems ridiculously overboard to do this for every photograph. But if you want a perfect image, take the time to do this. You will be glad that you did. And keep this handy. It'll be different, of course, for a different photograph. But for this project, what I like to do is I actually move it to the new position and then take those pictures, then move it to the new position to make sure I'm not getting my lines mixed up. If you're really detail oriented, get a box of crayons, colored pens of some type, and use alternating colors. You'll see the blocks a lot easier that way. I just use this and I slide it along and make sure I'm always in the right place. It just keeps everything in line and in order. It is so well worth the extra work. Remember, this photograph is going to be about 6,000 images. You do not want to get to the end of 6,000 images and realize the tip of an antenna didn't get included. What would your wife think of that anniversary present? So with the map finished, as you prepare to set up your first shot, one thing that I recommend you write on your forehead, because I constantly forget to do it and find out that I've forgotten again halfway through a shot. But do this. If you're using an XYZ table, and if you're going to shoot your image like I suggest, left to right, top to bottom, though that's entirely up to you, but if you're going to use that, make sure that your XYZ trim table is positioned as far to the right as it will go and as low as it will go. If you don't do that, if you have them somewhere in the middle of those ranges, and then as you move from photograph frame to photograph frame, you may run out of travel on your XYZ table. And that is actually a huge problem, because once you start taking pictures, you don't want to deviate from your map. And, at 10x magnification, you're right up on the subject, and you're never going to get it positioned the way it was. In repositioning it, you're going to end up rotating it, and that's the kiss of death. You must do everything to maintain as straight a perspective as possible. So it's bad enough that we are actually changing the perspective as we move the subject side to side. But if we also rotated it, it makes stitching them together pretty hit or miss. So get your table all set at the furthest reach of their extension, and then, and only then, take your pin and your insect and position them so they are front and center on the viewfinder with the table in that position. You can't then put the insect on the trim table, go to the camera, and then start fiddling with the trim table again. It's the one time you have to do it manually. So you will be so glad you did that when you're 44 panels into the photograph and you realize it won't go any lower. And that's a bad feeling. All right, so let me walk you through the equipment, the lighting really quickly, and then we'll get into taking the pictures. So I'm using a very basic setup. I'm using the Cognosys stack shot, and I'm using the auto distance mode. I have my step distance set pretty low, 17 or 18 microns. That is just to be absolutely sure I have enough overlap and I don't have any banding or areas that are out of focus. I use a flash trigger set on proximity mode so that it'll turn on my flashes without fail, as it usually does. I'm on a bellows. As you can see, the specimen is on a short, stout pin that I've put some Gorilla Tape on to give a bigger holding area for the grabber. I've maxed out the XYZ table to the right and to the height so that I have plenty of wiggle room. I'm using two simple flashes with a tracing paper diffusion coverings. You'll see I have a clean white card as my backdrop, and it has its own flash directed straight onto it from above, so that the ball of flash is going to hit right in line with the end of the objective. Lastly, the lens is a Nikon 10x microscope objective, an Achromat, the CFI plan, and it is attached directly to the business end of a Raynox 150 diopter. It's a 4.8 diopter, and that is attached directly to the end of my bellows. I'm using a tube length of 208 millimeters, which is the focal distance of the Raynox lens. So it's a classic infinity corrected setup. And yeah, that's it. That's the whole shebang. So I'm almost through with the shooting. I've decided to just go about halfway. So I've only got one or possibly two more frames to go. So I've already completed this photograph. So what I do next, first of all, I move the focus until I have something pretty well in focus. I know it's not great over this camera, but and then I will I'll use my trim table to move to the next location according to my map, which is right there. I'll check the landmarks. I thought I had cleaned this guy, but anyway. I'll check my landmarks just to make sure I'm exactly where I want to be. And then what I'll do is reset my settings on the stack shot. So I'll go to change settings. I'll select a new start position. That looks good. Then I'll select an end position. I use as the end position the last place I can see anything in focus, even way out on the periphery. There you go. Live view has just turned itself off, but that's what I do next anyway, so it just saved me a step. And now, with live view turned off, I start the cycle. And off she goes, and that is going to be another 76 photographs. I'm already up over 1,000. Who told you you couldn't have fun spending 9 hours taking one photograph? I can't move till the flash. So here we are in Lightroom, and I have 1,325 images that I collected. Some of the stacks were over 100 images deep. Some of them were a little less, 70, 80, something like that. I took all of the images, one stack at a time, over into Zerene Stacker, and I ran a PMax and a DMAP algorithm stack on them. In almost every case except the limbs, I went back and either did a selective stack to help with the retouching, or I started all over and did a slabbing run in order to get the separation that I wanted for the elements. So a tremendous amount of work has gone into boiling 1,325 images down to 13. So I thought, rather than me spending another 2.5 days going through the entire insect, which would, like I said at the beginning, would probably come out to about 5,000 or 6,000 images. I have other things I need to be getting on with, so we're not going to do that. But let me show you how I organize the images when I'm going to be stitching them together. So we have all of them right here. If you're a Lightroom user, I set up a separate collection which contains only the stacked and retouched images out of Zerene. So these are the final images that we're going to stitch together in Photoshop, and I'm just going to leave them where they are. So the actual process of stitching these images together is really rather simple if you have Photoshop. I've used a couple of other stitching programs, and honestly, I think Photoshop is about as good as any of them that I've used, with the possible exception of Microsoft ICE, which I really love, but it is a PC-only program. But the Adobe Photoshop really does a great job. All you need to do is open up Photoshop, and at the top menu, I'm sorry you can't see it, but go to File, go to Automate, and at the bottom of Automate is Photomerge, and it'll open a window asking you a few questions. What kind of layout do you want to use? Leave it on auto. It does a pretty good job. And select the files and add them into this window. Select all 13 and hit open. That puts all 13 of the files in here. I check blend images together. So once you have all of the images in the Photomerge window here, all you have to do is click OK. Every time I use this program, I'm really amazed at how quickly it does the computations for this. It's a good idea to make sure that nothing else is going on your computer. I certainly wouldn't do this while I was running stacks in the background. It probably takes about 5 minutes altogether before it spits out the output. It should go without saying that the output image from this process is absolutely massive. I had to dump thousands of old files just to make enough room on my hard drive to complete this project. So plan ahead if you're going to do this. I wasn't kidding when I said allow a week to shoot an entire insect, maybe even 2. All right, so it's getting there. It's putting the composition together now, and then it'll trim everything up. And there you have what we have so far. Now, it's done a fantastic job of putting together most of it. Unfortunately, it didn't put my arm on there. Let's see which one it is. If you hit Command T, is free transform. This belongs. I can see what the problem was. So maybe you can see why this image wasn't incorporated, even though it obviously fits right here. The reason is I didn't take the stack deep enough. I wasn't thinking when I took the first image, and what I should have done, of course, was add an additional 100 or so photographs to get all the way back to the edge of the insect shell. That would have then given Photoshop a point of reference to drop the leg in, because it's looking for an edge that doesn't exist. So this reminds me of one top tip that I really should have mentioned is if you decide to do something like this, you'll probably go through several memory cards, but I strongly recommend, if you're not shooting tethered, is to download all the photographs from your card before you disassemble anything. Leave all your lights, even leave your insect pinned, until you've had a chance to scan through all of your images and make sure you haven't done something like this. That is all there is to the stitching part. There's a whole lot more goes now into the retouching part. That's not the purpose of this video today. I'm not going to waste your time with that, but I would take this image now into Photoshop. I'd create a nice clean background and clean up any details that needed to be cleaned up, and go buy a new hard drive to store the photograph on. Well, I told you that was going to be a pretty involved process, and it certainly is. The take-home points are this. Select your subject carefully. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Something with clean edges, good contrast, a nice light background. Take your photographs in order and keep track of where you are. Stack your images carefully and thoughtfully. Use the best technique and don't skimp on retouching. You'll have opportunities to do more in Photoshop at the end, But it's really important that you have good inputs for the panorama first. If you need to use advanced techniques like slabbing, by all means do it. Whatever it takes to get the sharpest, crispest possible stack outputs for the panorama. Do not skimp on time at the end to go over into Photoshop and clean up all of those tiny details, because they will be visible on a 4-foot wide ant. Trust me. The way you get accomplished at this skill is by doing it over and over again, which is quite a dedicated commitment. But there's not much in macro photography as satisfying as finishing one of these projects with an image that you're really proud of. So I definitely urge you to give it a try if you've got the time and the inclination. Before I wrap things up today, I want to first of all thank my Patreon supporters. As always, thank you so much for your support. I literally could not be doing this without you. And thank you also to Andrew and Alison, as well as Roy, James, William, and Howard, all of whom have gone over to the website and made a contribution to the effort over there. That also is massively appreciated. It makes all the difference in the world, and thank you very much indeed. The next thing I have coming up is an answer session where I answer some of the more involved questions that I get on the YouTube channel. You won't want to miss that. The voting for the My Pandemic photography competition is almost at an end, and as soon as that's finished, I will make an announcement and I'll show you the fantastic pictures and let you know who the winners are. One last thing before I go. If you have any interest in private one-on-one photography mentoring or tutoring, either for a specific area that you're having issues with, or for a more overall general approach to the genre of photography you're interested in, get in touch. Contact at alanwallsphotography.com, and I can talk to you about availability and pricing and so forth. Until I see you again, have a great week or month or day, whatever time segment you find yourself in. I hope it's a wonderful one. I'll see you soon.